I think at the very least.
You don't know whether we'll be able to capture what we just did?
Yeah, correct.
Off camera?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I will tee that up. Dr. Steve and I had a very in-depth, good conversation about this podcast and this format in specific relation to the last session we had, in the last episode we did.
Because you told me I was old school.
Yeah, I did.
What did that mean to you when you said, yeah, I'm getting the sense you're old school, Dr. Harris?
So what I kind of brought up was like, I got the feeling, when I was talking through some of my family of origin stuff, that I got the impression that he was like, yeah, man, like you can't just blame your parents. That's
Right.
kind of what I articulated to Dr. Steve, to you. And, I kind of felt like, not that you were defending my parents, but you were pushing it more back on me to be like, well, what are you going to do about it? Everyone,
Right.
And so we then talked about it. And I think your response was kind of like, well, I'm reacting to what I know and what you're telling me.
Right.
And that led to a discussion about like what I feel comfortable sharing on this podcast and, what is not going to get shared on this podcast.
Right. And I specifically said that that based on what you shared with me, you've got the level of compassion that I have to give. So, I don't hear tales of woe like my parents beat me and we lived under in the gutter.
Which my parents did not beat me and we did not live in the gutter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
However, I totally understand what you were saying when you were like, when you were talking about your relationship with them, you talked about a lot of good, which there is a lot of good.
Yeah.
And then, Dr. Steve and I went on to talk about some other stuff that provided more context. And I think once you heard that, you're like, well, you're almost like, well, shoot,
Yeah.
I wish you'd have told me this. Like, this is good to know.
Yeah. And the constraints of this environment that we have are real. And I'm also, concerned that you don't do something in here with the hopes of, shock value or let's get more listeners because what kind of freaky things is Alex going to reveal this week as we peer into his psyche, it's not
healthy for sure. Yeah. And I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And my vision for this podcast has always been like, okay, this will never be able to one-to-one replicate authentic therapy, right? The vulnerability that a person can achieve in a room with no cameras, no microphones, and a professional.
Right.
We can never replicate that. However, what we can create...
And so you need to say why we can never replicate that.
And the reason we can never replicate that is because there are things that, for example, me personally, Alex, there are things
That's it.
that I want that have impacted me that involve other people.
Right.
And I can't, and I don't want to throw them under the bus, quote unquote.
I don't want our business to become the world's business.
Yep,
that's
correct.
Between you and these individuals. And in a therapy room without microphones and
you
cameras and stuff,
you
can say this is limited to confidentiality. But there are real world implications if you were to say, let me give you everything. And that's not to say anything that like there's horrible things happening in your family.
No, there are not. But there are things with all kinds of relationships that I have that I'm just not, I don't feel comfortable bringing it up because it involves another person. They have rights, they have rights to their privacy.
Yeah.
I don't want to do that.
So I think we get close there sometimes, like when you talked about the fantasy draft. Mm-hmm. So here's a host of men, I don't know how many of them there are, whose lives are impacted because you went out and said, this is what happens. We look forward to it, and then there's the drinking, and there's these things going on. And
I felt okay there because there were enough people, and I felt like no one was singled out.
Yeah. It was early on in the podcast. No one's listening. Dave wasn't sponsoring us at the time. Right. Like, this is pretty safe.
Yeah, but I did think about that, and that should be a good example of like how I feel comfortable approaching stuff. Like if I feel like there's enough anonymity, is that the right way to use that word? Anonymity. If I feel like I can achieve a safe level of anonymity, forget it. I definitely keep that in the front of my mind, which is a lot of responsibility, and I hope people like feel comfortable being around me still.
Right.
But it's not something that I take lightly at all. But it's an element that it's going to impact this podcast. But what I told Dr. Stephen, I'll continue to tell you, is like, I think what we have created here and what we continue to create, it's better than having nothing at all, because there's really no other resource for people to be like, what is it like? I want to see, something. And I like that we're creating something.
We're definitely creating something. So I have a daughter who listens to the podcast.
Yeah.
And she'll come to me and say, well, what do you think about Alex? What do you really think about him? And like, is he just this nervous guy or what?
Yeah.
She has, thoughts.
Theories?
she has thoughts and theories about
Yeah.
who Alex is. And does he really need therapy? It doesn't sound like he's too, like, I thought therapy was just for people, so she's,
Yeah.
so it's
The vicissitudes.
the vicissitudes of life. She's thinking about,
Totally.
what do people in therapy talk about? And, she was raised in a home with a therapist, and
I've always been curious about that experience, by the way.
yeah, call in, Maddie, and let us know what it's like, or any one of my kids. So like, I only get to respond to what I hear about in here and what's public access in this space.
And you're only going to, and I'm going to be reserved in some regards.
Yeah.
And you're not even going to know.
I'm not even going to know.
Yeah.
Because I don't have a magic 8-ball.
Yeah. You can't read
Actually,
my
I do
thoughts.
have one, but
yeah. And
all
I totally
signs point to yes.
that would be a great sponsor.
Magic 8-ball.
Magic 8-ball, bringing them back. And I wonder too if, like, maybe there's something I can say to you and be like, hey, I'm just so you know, I'm giving you the top line version. I don't know. It's one of the many mysteries of the pursuit that we're currently embarking upon. But I definitely don't want this to turn into a freak show, but I also understand too that part of what I'm doing, part of what we're doing, a lot of people listen just because they want to, it's maybe like reality TV to them in a weird way.
Well, I don't really have a clear sense of how this podcast is landing on people.
Yeah, me.
Like,
yeah.
I've
only heard the good, right? I've only heard from the people who've reached out to me, which are like, I like this. This is why I like it.
Yeah.
I've never heard from someone who's like, hey, yeah, I haven't heard from the people I haven't heard from.
Yeah.
But what I have heard, and the texts I do get are like, hey, this is like really cool. This is, really brave, which I don't really like that one. That one feels a little.
Yeah, but those are your friends.
Yeah, friends or family members. Yeah, but I don't know what the strangers are thinking.
Are there strangers?
I'm sure of it. Yeah, I'm sure of it. And again, my hope is that they're interested in therapy, or they've always been curious about it, as opposed to being curious about the quote unquote dark secrets of a person.
Yeah.
And being curious about watching someone be vulnerable,
And at the same time, I think that's part of being a therapist is there that voyeuristic tendency to look in other people's lives.
Totally. I mean, this is a good topic of conversation because most recently I just got a text today about a friend of mine who had discovered, I sent him the podcast and say, hey, check it out. And he started going through episodes and he really likes it. And he sent me a text today and he was like, I feel like this is too personal. I'll read it. It was actually quite on point. And he said, in a way, listening to these podcasts almost feels like a little invasion of privacy. I know you're doing it for a reason, but it's almost like I'm having a conversation with you about all this deep stuff. And he went on to say, but, like, I'm only hearing from you, you don't hear from me.
Right.
And I was like, that's fascinating. And I've started to meet people out in real life, and they'd be like, hey, I listen to your podcast.
Oh. Uh-huh.
And it's starting to be a little like Twilight Zone-y, right? I had someone at a party came up to me, and it was the first time meeting them. I'd never met them before. I knew of them. And they said, oh, this is so strange. I feel weird meeting you because I listened to your therapy sessions.
Oh.
And I was like, that is weird. Yeah, but that's cool. Like, I hope
Yeah.
it's been, a pleasant experience for you. So this is getting progressively weirder for me.
Yeah.
However, I continue to believe that it is good for people to be exposed to and talking about therapy at some level. And if people are looking at these and be like, Alex looks too happy, he doesn't need therapy. It's like, okay, well, maybe therapy will be less scary for you now, and maybe you'll feel comfortable doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I think of one of my family members who was like, I had never ever thought about going to see a therapist because it just was too scary to me.
Mm-hmm.
she's been listening to the podcast, and she was like, it seems not so scary.
Yeah.
That to me is a huge win.
Okay. Yeah.
But it definitely, sometimes it scares me too. Sometimes I get scared about like I sometimes feel bad about Haley. I'm like, am I losing, is she going to feel like she still has intimacy with me? Right. Because I share so much with the world, the internet, anyone.
Yeah.
Like, what does she get?
Yeah.
I worry about that. I don't want to turn into someone who's just like open to the world.
Right.
Some things need to be off limits and private, and yeah.
Yeah. I think that part of this conversation also begs the issue of how will you know, like, when you start therapy with somebody, you ask the question, the therapist should say, okay, what are our goals? What are we working on? How will we know when we're done?
Yeah.
How will you know when the podcast is done?
I was thinking about the same thing, Dr. Steve, because I was like, I wonder when he's going to start asking, like, hey, like, we've done a bunch of episodes. What next? I don't have an answer to that, honestly. I don't know. I think it would just be you saying something, like you being like, hey, I don't want to do this anymore. And then, honestly, I feel so compelled and passionate about this idea.
Might get another therapist.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
1,000,000%. And that's no, that's no commentary on you whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's just, I believe in this idea, and
well, the iconic thing for me is that when we started this, you said, therapy is a good place to go because, maybe you're like walking around and you see a cloud and it reminds you of something.
Yep.
And so that's kind of like I think I may have said this before. I've never had a client come and say, I saw this cloud and it reminded me of this thing.
Yeah.
Everybody I meet with is talking about somebody else. There's very few people who, and that becomes the fodder for pointing the conversation back around to yourself eventually. Like if you're doing individual therapy, when you're doing couples or families, you're talking about the people who are in the room. But by and large, when an individual is coming to talk to me about somebody in their life, their partner, their parent, their child, the key is like you can't control that other person. So what are you going to do about it yourself?
I know.
So I think, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that's going to limit what we can do here, because I'm always going to want to know, okay, so bring it around to yourself. If you give me the worst case scenario, or give me the thing that's troubling you or that you're concerned about, and then I can respond to that. But if there's more that I don't know,
exactly,
it's hard for me to
100%.
to bring up more compassion, more understanding.
Yeah. You need to know all the details, and I can't provide all the details all the time because of
you're not trying to navigate that boundary. That
I don't want to expose or embarrass or shame anyone.
Right.
And that is the catch-20. I don't know if that amounts to a catch-22. However, it's one of the limitations of what we're trying to do. But it is what it is. It doesn't make it any better. It doesn't make it any worse. It's just something to navigate. And what I wanted to say earlier about, I got a little defensive when I felt like you were saying, well, hey, this isn't about them. This, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
Right. At the end of the day, I still appreciate that approach. It felt at the moment, a little too soon for me.
Yeah.
But that didn't make it less true for me as well, too. Because I firmly believe that honestly, I don't know if you want to call it a pitfall, but like a danger of therapy is this kind of this idea, like talk is cheap. At the end of the day, like you got to be willing to do something.
Mm-hmm.
So I 100% appreciate it. And, I'm so glad we had this off-camera conversation where I was able to share what I needed to share.
Yeah.
And it also was reassuring to me for you to react the way you did, which is like, oh, like this would have been good to know, Alex, but that's kind of the craziness that is what we're doing here.
Yeah. And my, my worry is that,
not that it's, and I got to stop using the word crazy. That's kind of like, I got to stop using that word.
My worry is that the need to provide content for this will drive you to do or say something that you're not ready to do,
No.
not ready to say.
That's why I have a safety net.
and I'm really reassured that you have a real therapist, not
Yeah.
not a pretend
An almost doctor.
not a pretend therapist over here.
Yeah.
That you can go and say, "Oh crap, I outed my
Yep.
my mom. I outed my dad on this thing or whatever." And
that was part of the deal. That's the way I looked at it. It was like, I'm only going to do this if I have safety checks in place.
yeah,
And that's why I feel comfortable doing it, is because I can have private conversations to work through. And I do a lot of my sessions with George. We talk about stuff here.
yeah,
And I sometimes feel bad. Like I sometimes feel like I out him in a weird way, commenting on how he approaches it. And he's not here in the room to talk about why he approaches things the way that he does. But we talk about that. So
I think the number one reason people go to therapy is for relationship problems.
yeah.
Because it's either something that I'm doing, or a way that I'm showing up, or a way that my partner or someone in my sphere is showing up.
It's fascinating to hear you say that, though, because I'm trying to think why I went to therapy, and I'm pretty sure it was so long ago, but I was unhappy with the way that I was living, but maybe it was a relationship too.
But that could be merely the feedback you're getting from other people.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So you might have these interactions with people, and you're going, okay, what's wrong with me?
Sure.
Why does this keep
I think that's
happening?
accurate.
And so we judge ourselves. We show up in relation to in the context of relationships.
Yeah.
And so I'm always like, am I like that? Am I like this? Am I like that? And that should probably be the kind of thing, I think, that goes on in human beings' heads a lot. We compare ourselves. I'm not as loud as that guy, or am I as big as that person? Or am I, on a variety of things.
My podcast as good as that person's podcast?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Who else is Dave sponsoring?
I'll get to the bottom of that.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, and that kind of speaks to like comparisons. Is that kind of what you were getting at?
Yeah. Well, I think we do comparisons all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think human beings are discerning entities, that we look at somebody, and in a split second we make judgments based on visual cues and other things, the kind of clothes people are wearing, their skin
Behavior.
color, behavior, what they're driving, are they not driving, what, and we jump to all these conclusions, and then we get to temper our conclusions when we find out more about them.
Yep. And it also impacts the conclusions we make about ourselves.
Sure.
Which is weird. It's like observing things about other people. I extrapolate things that quote unquote must be true about me then, right?
Yep.
If someone treats me this way, there must be something
Or is there something
that.
about, is there what did I do to contribute to that?
Yeah. No, I would agree. I mean, we're relational animals. Like
Yeah.
we're just, we don't exist in a vacuum. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because in the last session, I talked about going to a dinner, my friend from high school, going to a dinner at his parents' house.
Yeah.
And we talked about the podcast, and his sister was really, really interested. And she asked a lot of really good questions.
Uh-huh.
And she was like, well, do you talk about stuff on your podcast that you don't talk about, that you also talk about with your real therapist? Like, which one's more valuable to you?
Yeah.
Where do you, do you talk about other people? She asked Haley. She's like, Haley, how do you feel? Does he talk about you?
Yeah, great questions.
Yeah, and
she should sponsor the next show.
yeah, right. Yeah, I couldn't say her name, right, because of the boundaries. The boundaries I've set.
Anonymity.
Yeah.
What is that? What we're saying?
Anonymity. An anemone. It's an anemone. Have you seen Finding Nemo?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Don't hurt yourself, kid.
Yeah. I'd love to get Pixar to sponsor. That's the goal. Anyway, yeah. So that element of this is, I think, on people's minds.
Mm-hmm.
And the short of it is, I don't have the concrete answer, but I do have an idea of, again, the rules are very simple for me. I'm going to do my 100% best not to really use any names or any identifying info. Like, I just don't want to put anyone under the bus.
Mm-hmm.
I had a conversation with an old friend, and we were talking about the podcast, and one of the first things I could tell on his mind was he was worried, like, is this going to make it on the pod? And I told him, I was like, nope, it's not. So don't worry.
But you should think that if you're Alex's friend.
I'm sure they're thinking. I'm sure. And he had told me, he was like, I thought that this episode, the episode where you talk about wanting to Like, be real with people.
Uh-huh.
I thought you were making a dig at me.
Huh.
And I was like, absolutely not. But also, I'm sure you're not alone. I'm sure people are listening and be like,
Yeah.
he's talking about me, he's talking about me. And that's weird too. But again, I have to do my best to like make sure that everyone, like no one feels like their privacy is invaded. But that's why I think the most challenging conversations are the family ones,
Yeah.
right? Those are that is going to be tough to navigate. And that's why I do front load all of those with how much they
know
mean
they
to
love me.
Yeah, and how much I love them. That's why, right? Because I need everyone to know that.
You want everyone to know.
Yeah, correct. Yep. And all of the good that I have comes from them, right? And it's like, well, you're talking about the bad. It's like, okay, there are a few things that don't sit right with me, but there's a lot of things that sit really well with me.
Yeah.
I just want to talk about the things that don't sit well right now.
But see, even having this conversation, if I was your mom or dad, I'd be like, okay, so what did you talk about off camera?
Yes. Yeah,
Right?
and that's
Right.
something I would...
So, Alex, obviously, yes, you know we love you, but what is the stuff you want to talk about that you can't talk about?
If this podcast led to that conversation, that would be a win for this podcast for me personally, because that would bring me to a level of closeness with my family that I would have otherwise never had.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'm down for the cause. It's just a weird way, and I feel bad. Like, I don't know if you said this or someone said this, but like...
Hang on, is it brilliant? If it's brilliant, I probably said it.
Yeah, okay. It was accurate, which is, it would be hard.
Wasn't me then.
It would be hard to, it would be an experience to have me for a son, right? Because I'm pretty not public facing, but like I express a lot. I do a lot of weird things. I went to North Korea to play hockey. Like that was the whole thing. Like I'm not my son got a job at an accounting firm. He's doing really well. Like that's just never been the thing with me. So I appreciate that. And I cut them, I give them credit and I cut them slack because like I can't imagine having a me, right? And having to raise a me. That would be, it's like, what do you do? What does this thing do? He's just doing all this crazy stuff. What do I do? So yeah, it's, it's getting real, but that's good. I'm
with
really,
limits.
With limits. And I'm now a part of me wants to like, I feel like your daughter is on the fence about me. And now I'm like, how can I win her over that? Like, I don't know what kind of conclusion she came to, but again, my only hope for people is that they walk away feeling like therapy isn't as scary as they thought it was.
Well, the reality is part of the reality, from my understanding, is she listens to it and goes and says, Alex is looking for someone to talk to. She goes, but I was raised by a therapist. And so I've always talked about these things. So she talks about how her husband says to her, who's been in our family, he's a wonderful guy. He loves me 100%.
Yeah.
And he's been a great addition, but he's like, your family talks about stuff all the time. Your family talks about their emotions. They talk about their feelings. They talk about, and so
she's like, it was normal.
It was part of the culture. And I don't say that to blow my own horn or anything like that. Or my,
Where's
my wife's
do I have
horns.
a horn? I don't have, I might have one.
But different families have different cultures and things like that. So, and she
looks at this as
she's
like
looking
normal.
at this and she's going, oh, this is causing her to reflect on the way she was raised and the different environment that she had access to. Yeah.
I mean, it would, again, that's why it's so fascinating about like developing a relationship with Haley and seeing her family interactions.
How
and
they
stuff.
do Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Right?
Their context, it's like, whoa, this is totally different.
Yeah. Right.
And that's not even to say, like, obviously I had family dinners with other families and I've met other families too.
Yeah.
But, and what I love about Haley is she definitely takes me outside of my like personal, like relationship bubble in terms of like, I don't know, just the way I feel like the environment I grew up in, a lot of the families were somewhat similar.
Yeah.
And then she's different and it's great. I love the context and it rounds me out and it's good. Yeah.
And there are constraints in our work because I would probably not have seen an individual for as long as I've met with you in my practice without without saying, I'd love to, you talk a lot about Haley, have her come in sometime, have her join us sometime.
It's funny you say that because I've thought about that. Like I want, and I've talked to George about this. Like, I've been seeing him for, 7 years, which I'm probably in your brain. You're probably like, wow.
Yeah. I don't do that at all.
Red flag. But,
no, not at all. It's just, I just don't do it.
And we've talked about like, well, I bring her in. And he'd been like, bring your parents in if they want. I was like, well, they wouldn't want to come, George. I'm sorry. But I think about that. It would be really cool. Like I would get enjoyment out of that. But yeah, it is fascinating. And I like too your approach in terms of like, it's different in the sense that, I think you're more goal oriented. I mean, you get that vibe.
Sometimes.
And that's another thing too, is like someone has asked me like, well, how are they different? Your real therapist and your podcast therapist. I'm like, yeah, they have vastly different approaches.
Yeah.
And George is really fascinated by that because I'll talk about, the podcast work with you, and he'll be like, well, and I think at one point he's like, you should ask Dr. Steve, like how, therapy really ultimately comes down to like human beings, in the sense that therapists are human beings, and they study what they study and they come to conclusions, and there are hundreds of different conclusions and like suggestions on how to approach therapy in people, and like how do you juggle all of those different approaches.
And he shows up, George, and all therapists show up with their accumulated life experience to sit in this chair at this moment, and that weighs in on how we think about things. Those are all the filters that we carry, right? And so I have different experiences than him. We have some commonalities. If you think about Venn diagrams, I'm sure there's some overlap. But ultimately, I have different filters and different ways of seeing things, and he does too. And he'll pay attention to different things and cue in on certain things, and others, I'll cue in on other things.
It's fascinating, and in a weird way, that experiencing that has been very helpful for me.
But the bottom line, though, is that hopefully you get someone who will listen, who will be understanding, and will reflect back to you their honest opinion about what they're hearing.
Yes. And even as silly as this may sound, getting those first two, for me personally, are the most important.
The first
2 points you made 3 points. I forget what they were, but
they were brilliant,
like listening,
hearing and understanding.
Hearing and understanding.
Yeah.
Those are, for me, for Alex, that was such an eye-opening, revelation to experience that from a professional, hearing and listening. And like, I think every human being deserves to be heard and listened to. Mm-hmm. And I think every human being has things that they feel like they can't share. And that is a tragedy to me. It's so, and I was talking about this with my family. Mm-hmm. I was talking about this with one of my family members who, why she said she was afraid of, therapy. It scared her. And I was like, it makes me so sad to think that there are things that we as people feel and think about ourselves. And we're like, if anyone knows this, I'm ruined. Yeah. Like that's messed up. It shouldn't be that way. Like, I wish it wasn't that way. Right. And to me, therapy has been a place to share those things. Yeah. And to be like, oh, okay, I'm not weird. Like, I'm not crazy. It's okay to think this or feel this or be this way.
To share those things and still have acceptance.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think the biggest fear, at least for me, and maybe other people can relate to this, the biggest fear has been rejection, being ostracized, being cast aside for being different or weird or whatever. No one wants to be left alone.
Yeah. There's a Harvard lawyer.
Harvard. Oh, wow.
Harvard lawyer, Brian Stevenson. You may have heard of his work. He wrote a book called Just Mercy, and I think it got made into a movie. He's a lawyer. I think he works down in Louisiana, Alabama. Sorry. Okay. And he is trying to overturn many death row kinds of convictions, lack of evidence, things like that. They've got several overturned. Brian Stevenson, he has a quote that I bring to my mind many times. He goes, I have this belief that we are not the sum total of our worst decisions, the worst things about us. So if you're a liar, you're not just a liar. If you're a murderer, you're not just a murderer, that you have other redeeming qualities. And so this is what guides his work. And I find a lot of congruency with that in therapy, that therapy can be a place where somebody comes in and says, I'm doing this horrible thing, or I've done this horrible thing. And the therapist is in a position to not absolve but just to hold it and say, it's okay to leave that in here. It's okay to be that part of you. And I don't think that you're all that.
Yeah.
You're not,
Yep.
That's not the only thing that makes up who you are. So
Yep. That thing doesn't make you, it's not
Doesn't
mutually
define you.
exclusive from
Yeah.
being a human.
Yeah.
Like just because you have that thing doesn't mean you're also a human.
But so many of us let those things define us.
Totally.
Like I am this murderer. I am this adulterer. I am this liar.
It's not entire. I mean, it's a little bit related to what you're talking about. As you were saying that, it reminds me of this thing that I think of frequently, especially when I like encounter, homeless people who are suffering from mental illness. I always stop and think to myself, at one point in their life, they were a kid and they probably liked riding their bike and playing, and maybe they had a toy car collection. Like they were a human, just a child, normal. Like every person was at one point, just a child. And then life is what takes them into these, weird or different directions.
Yeah.
And I don't know, at the end of the day, we're all human.
Well, in talking with a student who interviewed at one of our graduate programs, this is when I worked back in Texas, he reported that he had been homeless for several years and, moved his life around and changed things. He was applying to graduate school and stuff. But he talked about the biggest, the hardest part about being homeless is being invisible, that people don't look at you. People don't understand what you're talking about. That I was once a kid who liked to ride my bike.
Yep.
I was once a kid who wanted Kool-Aid at the end of the day, or was hoping for a popsicle when the ice cream truck came by, or whatever.
Totally.
Or
had a favorite TV show, had a favorite book, wanted to be like someone when they grew up.
Yeah. That invisibility that it's so damaging to human beings.
Yes. Yeah, it's dehumanizing.
Yeah.
Isn't there a book?
Always a book.
There is always a book. Man, it's not. Is it an Invisible Man?
I'll bet there is an Invisible Man.
It was a book about a guy who falls into a sewer or something. And I'm pretty sure it was. I really should have read the books in high school. I spark noted so many books. I really am. I feel so bad because like there were all these really important books that I was just like, okay, let me get the cheat sheet here.
Yeah.
But the idea was about the premise of the book was this idea of like being seen, and this idea, I'm pretty sure it had to do with race relations, and it was like the civil rights era and like, not being viewed as a human and not being viewed as equal. What does that do to the psyche?
Yeah.
Yeah. The line you said, I think it was one of the first episodes, like there's no greater feeling than to share your humanity with others. Mm-hmm. And I believe that. I mean, it's so true. Mm-hmm. And therapy to me has been a morsel of moments where I can do that. Like that's why they're therapeutic moments, because I can share my humanity with someone and I'm not judged in that moment. I'm listened to and valued and reassured that like, hey, you still have value. In spite of
who I am, what I did.
Yep. And sometimes too, it's been a process of learning that I don't need to look at it as in spite of. Like it's not a bad thing. It's a thing. And I don't need to feel guilty about it.
Yeah, it's part of what makes me me.
Granted, they're not things like murder. I'm not saying like, oh, I'm murdering people.
No one knows what we talk about off camera.
Oh, the FBI's they're like, wait, maybe we should be paying attention to this podcast. But yeah, this is all really great stuff. And again, this podcast and this idea is, unique in its own right. And it's a work in progress, if you will, and a journey. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because I think a lot of listeners have these questions.
Yeah.
And it's helpful for them to understand that like, hey, I personally am just kind of figuring this out as I go, but with basic structures in place, like guardrails, if you will.
Right.
And, I appreciate you, Dr. Steve, seeking out, like, if there are times where you need more context, I think as we continue to do this, you'll get a feel like, hey, is there stuff am I getting the full picture here? Maybe I tell you, maybe I'm saying, no, you're not. and we talk about it off or whatever. But yeah, I know this is weird and not normal. And hey, you're doing a great job. But my mom's a huge fan.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And with that,
Let's call it.
let's call it. So thank you once again for joining me, Dr. Steve. It's always a pleasure. And I'll see you next session.
All right. Take care.
All right. Stay happy, everyone. I think that's going to be my catchphrase. Stay happy. All right. Bye.